I learned of Alice N. Lincoln's tireless work on behalf of Boston's poor while performing my research of Rainsford Island, located in the Boston Harbor. She was a remarkable person and a tireless, effective advocate in any cause that she undertook. Mrs. Lincoln was educated in Philadelphia at the Mary Anna Longstreth School and the Agnes Irwin School. Later in life, she continued her education in Boston by attending the School for Social Workers. During the late 1800s, the people who lived in the squalor of the tenements or confined at the hellish institutions were often spoken of as the unfortunates. That term may have eased the public's consciousness, as it implied their suffering was predetermined by fate. The poor and the sick were relegated to live a life of misery. Classifying them as unfortunates made it easy for the public not to be shocked by the early deaths of adults, as well as many children. Mrs. Lincoln did not accept what others considered to be their fate. July 5, 1903, the Boston Sunday Post published an interview of Mrs. Lincoln. It was done at her Manchester, Massachusetts residence. The article appeared on the front page above the fold. The final slide details a few of the many negative consequences that followed her being the focus of public praise. The article also included the only physical description, as well as her picture, that I was able to locate of Mrs. Lincoln. Not an aggressive 20th century strong-minded woman, but a woman of the old school, who, by her wonderful personality and long-headed advice, wins people to her cause. Mrs. Lincoln has brown eyes that look at one straight, as though probing for truth. There are changing lights in them, too, which bespeak moods, though she would impress one as a person of even temperament. There is a natural dignity in her bearing, which inspires respect and admiration. In 1908, at age 55, her health failed as a result of her many years advocating on behalf of the poor. Her ability to fight for her causes was extinguished after decades of challenging Boston's entrenched political system. Mrs. Lincoln had many successes, but her self-sacrifice was paid for with her health. Alice North Towne Lincoln was born in Philadelphia on November 13, 1853. On November 3, 1880, she and Roland Crocker Lincoln were married by Reverend Phillips Brooks at the Trinity Church. Prior to their marriage, Roland and Alice were members of the Boston Society of Decorative Arts. Perhaps that is where they met. Mrs. Lincoln was a descendant of William Towne. Mr. Towne had 3 daughters who, in 1692, were accused of practicing witchcraft in Salem. Rebecca Towne Nurse, age 71, mother of 8 children, and Mary Towne Easty, age 58, mother of 9 children, were executed. Sarah Towne Bridges Cloyes, age 52, mother of 13 children, was interrogated, imprisoned, and then released. She moved to Framingham, Massachusetts. John Henry Towne was Mrs. Lincoln's father. His fortune was first made in the business of engineering and construction. Prior to the Civil War, the firm he headed, J.P. Morris, Towne and Company, made the largest engines for war vessels, monitors, and other machinery. When the Civil War began, he offered his gratuitous services in any capacity where he could be useful. He inherited his love of fine arts, music, and food from his father, John Towne. After the war, he was a member of the Franklin Institute Philosophic Society. His passion was in the reconstruction and advancement of the University of Pennsylvania. He made a bequest of $1 million to the university. In 1867, he purchased 25 acres at Eagle Head, Manchester, Massachusetts, where he eventually built his summer home. He also acquired considerable acreage in the Kettle Cove area. His will provided that 85 acres of the Kettle Cove property be given to the University of Pennsylvania. From 1884 to the 1920s, the lots were sold off. That area is now known as University Lane. In 1878, Mrs. Lincoln was instrumental in raising money to buy much of the woodland along Old School Street in Manchester and Southern Avenue in Essex, including what was known as Cathedral Pines. This land was now an important part of the Manchester-Essex Conservation Trust. Mrs. Lincoln's mother was Maria Rebecca Tevis. She was active in many of Boston's social causes. From 1875 to 1889, she was the director of the New England Hospital for Women and Children in Roxbury. Alice would later hold that title. Helen Carnan Towne Jenks was Mrs. Lincoln's sister. In 1874, she married Dr. William Furness Jenks, who was an obstetrician and gynecologist. He contracted tuberculosis early in his career and died in 1881. Mrs. Jenks then founded a tuberculosis cottage at Saranac Lake and became a well-known health crusader by the end of the 19th century. In 1886, she founded the Visiting Nurse Society of Philadelphia, and it still exists today as the Visiting Nurses Association of Greater Philadelphia. Mrs. Lincoln's brother was Henry Robinson Towne. During the Civil War, he was a mechanical draftsman working on heavy marine engines for monitors and other war vessels at the Boston and Portsmouth Navy Yards. In early 1868, with his father, John Henry Towne, putting up 60% of the capital, Henry entered into a partnership with Linus Yale, Jr., who had invented the Yale lock. The company was incorporated as the Yale Lock Manufacturing Company. When Yale died at age 47 in December 1868, Henry Towne became president of the company. The following year, he and his father acquired the remaining interest from Yale's family estate. Mrs. Lincoln's aunt was Anne Sophia Towne Dara. She was an outstanding landscape artist. Upon her death in 1872, the MFA held a retrospective exhibit of her work, with 262 of her paintings on display. In 1882, 136 of her watercolors were sold at auction to various persons for $4,189. The proceeds benefited the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. At the turn of the century, Mrs. Lincoln would become very active in the Animal Rescue League of Boston. As members of the Boston Society of Decorative Arts, Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln would have met Martin Brimmer, founder and first president of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. During the 1880s, Mr. Lincoln became the president of the Society of Decorative Arts. The Museum of Fine Arts Boston holds 34 items donated on November 14, 1896 by Mrs. Lincoln. 32 items were lithographs created by British watercolorist Samuel Prout. Mrs. Lincoln's most valuable item was The Day Before Parting, painted in 1862 by Joseph Israels. She gifted it to the Museum of Fine Arts on June 16, 1918. Mrs. Lincoln's 1926 will noted, "I give and bequeath to the Musée du Louvre of Paris, France, for the benefit of the French people, the painting by William Morris Hunt, known as La Marguerite. But upon the express condition that it shall, upon and after acceptance and receipt thereof, always remain in the possession and ownership of said musée. I request that said painting, when hung, be labeled Bequest of Alice N. Lincoln, of Boston, USA. I make this gift because William Morris Hunt derived much of his inspiration from French art, and because it was the desire of Emperor Napoleon III that the painting should be purchased for the Palace of St. Cloud. William Morris Hunt also painted the portrait of Mrs. Lincoln's mother, which he bequeathed to her brother Henry. There is an interesting story relating to the William Morris Hunt painting known as La Marguerite. Morris actually did 2 of them. The first is the one that Mrs. Lincoln bequeathed to the Louvre, and the second is held by the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. The story was told by Helen M. Knowlton in her biographic book, The Art-Life of William Morris Hunt. It is available as a PDF on Google Books. On September 19, 1907, Mrs. Lincoln presented a bronze work to the New England Hospital for Women and Children in memory of her mother, Maria Rebecca Tevis. Mrs. Towne was the director of the hospital from 1875 to 1880. The memorial was a beautiful bronze relief sculpted by Augustus St. Gaudens called The Angel, Amor Carita. Mrs. Lincoln was named a director in 1906. The newspaper article announcing the dedication of the statue noted that it appeared to have been a special commission by Augustus St. Gaudens for Mrs. Lincoln. Quote, "This was the last, personally superintended bronze, the famous sculptor's angel. Others were doubtless made, but the rare tinting was the mark of St. Gaudens alone, as posed by Anne Page for the sculptor." The statue has an unusually small hexagon base. The curator of the St. Gaudens National Historic Park in Cornish, New Hampshire, noted that, quote, "It is the only one I have seen with that shaped base. Additionally, St. Gaudens had been a patient at that hospital," unquote. Bill McAvoy's attempts to locate the memorial have been unsuccessful. Those attempts included contacting the present facility, the Dimmock Community Health Center. The staff was very helpful, but had no record of where it has gone. Mrs. Lincoln was very active in the cremation movement. In 1893, she read the following at the annual meeting of the New England Cremation Society. Quote, "It is with great diffidence that I approach the subject which we are met together to discuss this evening. I am sure there are many among the audience who have thought more deeply on this subject, or have considered more carefully the value of cremation than I, but there is one reason, a sacred one, which gives me the right to speak reverently of what seems to me are its essential points, at the same time to enter a plea for its adoption. Some years ago, when the whole question of cremation was less understood, and therefore less in favor than it is today, a dear relative of mine, one of the nearest and dearest there can be to anyone, undertook to investigate and see for herself what the methods of cremation employed in Philadelphia, where, as you know, a building for the purpose has been in existence for some time. At her death, a request that her remains might be disposed of in this manner, provided those nearest to her were willing that this disposition should be made, needless to say that her wishes were complied with. To many it doubtless seems a dreadful thing, notwithstanding the self-devoted words of Scripture, though I give my body to be burned, that there should in this age in any way be a wholesale destruction of the human frame, a literal rendering of ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Let us then, I repeat, be very tender and patient with those who are not willing at once to consign all that is dear to the flames, instead of to the tomb. It is a different matter when we come to the other side of the question, namely, that which concerns public health. Here, indeed, we do not need to pause, for there can be no hesitation between the danger to health from the slow, lingering process of decay and the absolute sanitary conditions of cremation. We cannot, perhaps, recall any instance in more modern times when cause and effect were so distinctly discernible, and yet it must have occurred to all of us that in the case of smallpox, cholera, scarlet fever, diphtheria, we were incurring a serious risk to others by permitting the ordinary forms of burial. I hope some of us may live to see the day when it shall be ordered by law and sanctioned by public opinion that the body of any person dying of a contagious disease, pronounced such by a reputable physician, shall be cremated as a protection to society and in pursuance of the laws of health. It may be too much to expect that public opinion will sanction the annihilation of the human body in cases of death from non-contagious disease, but as a safeguard to the community, it will be a most valuable means of preventing the spread of contagion. If cremation can be universally adopted in those cases where death has occurred from contagious sickness, I shall leave it for others far abler than I to show the religious side of the practice of cremation. That it has a religious side none of us can deny, for it embodies one of the highest principles of religion, the consideration of the welfare of our fellow men. Alice North Lincoln died March 17, 1926. She was cremated at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Roland C. Lincoln died April 7, 1926. He was not cremated. Both are buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Mrs. Lincoln was a director of the Home for Aged Women. It was located at 108 Revere Street in Boston. Quote, "For indigent women of American parentage who have resided in Boston the 10 years preceding application and are over 60. When able, each inmate assists in the work of the home, about 90 beds. Inmates can visit their friends by permission of the matron. Friends of inmates visit from 2 to 5 Wednesday and Saturday. The public, Wednesday afternoon." Unquote. Mrs. Lincoln made a bequest in her will of $500 to the Home for Aged Women. Mrs. Lincoln was also a director for the Burnap Free Home for Aged Women, 38 Pleasant Street in Upham's Corner. Also known as Miss Burnap's Home for Aged and Friendless Women, it provided a home for older, Protestant women. Mrs. Lincoln was a driving force in the creation of an emergency hospital for insane and delirious persons in the city of Boston. In 1906, she gave testimony at government hearings, speeches to the public, and letters to newspapers. In 1908, she filed a bill for the creation of the hospital. That bill failed, perhaps as she endorsed the project. However, the hospital was eventually built between 1910 and 1912. In 1907, Mrs. Lincoln became a director for the New England Hospital for Women and Children. As mentioned earlier, her mother was a director from 1875 to 1880. The hospital was founded in 1862 by Dr. Marie Zarkeska and Edna Dawn Cheney. For over a century, it was a teaching hospital where women doctors and nurses could study and practice medicine, and women could receive treatment from female doctors. It was the first hospital in Boston to offer obstetrics, gynecology, and pediatrics all in one facility. The concept grew out of Zarkevska's close friendships with influential women in Boston. During its first 10 years, the NEH served primarily the immigrant population of the area. The hospital closed in 1969 and reopened as an outpatient clinic. The clinic was renamed the Dimmock Community Health Center. In 1875, Mrs. Lincoln accompanied her parents on a tour of Europe, where she experienced the tenements of Berlin and Birmingham, England, firsthand. That experience may have led to her activism in tenement reform. Her first project was in 1879. Mrs. Lincoln and a young lady friend were disturbed by the filth and misery which they saw in certain tenement houses that they visited. In connection with the associated charities, they determined to do something to better the condition of these poor people. They leased a large house at the corner of Chardon and Merrimack Streets for $1,000 a year. It contained 27 tenements. The house had the worst possible reputation for morality, and it had been under the ban of the police for a long time. It was half empty due to the degraded character of the occupants. The entries and corridors were blackened with smoke and dingy. Everything was dirty and neglected. The sinks were in dark corners and were foul and disease-breeding. However, they were resolute and deliberately set themselves to perform the seemingly impossible. They painted the interior, improved the lighting and ventilating, and new sinks were ordered. Wood and coal closets arranged for each tenement had its own landing. Previously, the tenants had to keep their fuel in the cellar. The moldy wallpaper was removed from the entries, and a fresh surface of plastering was put on. A few of the worst tenants had to be removed, but the majority, pleased with the new administration of things, were willing to accept its rules and remain. Tenants were soon found for every room, and the house, which had been regarded as very unhealthy, had been a regular hive for fevers under the old regime of carelessness and greed, that did not care how dirty the tenants were so long as they paid their rent. Under the new rules of cleanliness, the tenants became so healthy that disease was almost unknown, and was, and is, to this day, known by the tenants of the neighborhood generally as the Good Luck House. The ladies collected their own rents and kept everything well under their own supervision. By the end of the first year, they were able to make a small profit. The concept of earning a return on philanthropic investment began in London in 1863. Sir Sidney Waterlow founded the Improved Dwellings Company, Ltd. of London. It was a private philanthropic enterprise. He considered charity false philanthropy, harmful to the self-respect of the poor man. He conducted his tenements on a business basis. The affluent of Boston adopted that model. With the approval of the Commonwealth's legislature, the Boston Cooperative Building Company, BCBC, was formed on May 25, 1871. William Gray, Abby May, Henry B. Rogers were the named officers. The Articles of Incorporation stated that shares were to be sold at $25 per share. Dividends were not to exceed 7% per annum. The potential of the return on their investment may have assisted in raising capital. Bylaws were set by the officers and required that 1/2 of the officers were to be women. By June 16, 1871, 8,000 shares were sold at $25 per share. On July 16th, their first acquisition was purchased on East Canton Street. The Palace, on Lincoln Street, was the next project to be acquired and renovated. Alice N. Lincoln was appointed a director of the BCBC in 1882. Mrs. Lincoln's husband, Roland, became a director in 1885. They remained on the board until at least 1897. On April 8, 1891, the Boston Globe reported that Mrs. Lincoln testified at the State House regarding her knowledge of the common practice of tenement residents using their units as sweating shops. At that time, she owned or controlled 16 or 18 tenement houses in Boston. She supported the bill to regulate the sweating system and that a limit should be set for the number of sewing machines to be used in one room. She decried the fact that dwelling houses should be turned into shops or used for mechanical purposes. On May 8, 1891, Mrs. Lincoln was one of several speakers at Huntington Hall. She noted that the workers' pay was miserable and inadequate, as well as recommended that landlords could do much to remedy matters by providing more supervision of their properties. On December 16, 1892, the Boston Globe noted her as the godmother of the poor and distressed. Her belief from the beginning of her activism in 1879 was that many of the people living in squalor would be glad to live in more decent places if they could find them. Her practice was to visit each tenant to collect the rent and revisit them on Saturday to ensure the cleanliness of the units and common areas. She visited new families once a day for the first 2 months. Mrs. Lincoln was a member of the Associated Charities of Boston from its founding in 1882. That year she was active in their Dwellings of the Poor Committee. Robert Treat Paine, Jr. was the chairman. In 1892, Mr. Paine, Jr. became the president of the Associated Charities of Boston. He spoke at the first meeting of the large Committee to Provide Better Homes for Boston's Poor. Mrs. Lincoln was the chairman of that committee. Mrs. Lincoln was an advocate for having an outdoor area for children to play and benefit from fresh air. The alternative was children playing on the flat roofs of the tenement. She recounted an instance of a child at play falling to their death from a roof. On December 28, 1902, the New York Tribune reported that after more than 90 years, the famous Park Street Church at the corner of Tremont and Park Street had been sold to a developer for $1,250,000. It was to be replaced by a skyscraper office building. That followed the sale of the Broadway Tabernacle in Manhattan. Both religious landmarks were to give way to business enterprise. On January 14, 1903, an 18-person preservation committee was formed. Mrs. Lincoln joined it, applying her usual approach, both feet in. By January 15, 1903, the committee raised $100,000 of the anticipated $1,250,000 needed to repurchase the church. Mrs. Lincoln's brother-in-law, William H. Lincoln, also became a member. At that time, Mr. Lincoln was the president of the Boston Chamber of Commerce. On February 27, 1903, Mrs. Lincoln and the committee appeared at a hearing in the State House in an attempt to have the church made part of the Metropolitan Park District. That effort failed. The quick resolution of the matter was reported in the Boston Globe on April 3, 1903, with the caption, "Church is saved." Quote, "Plan to buy the Park Street edifice fails. Syndicate gives up the project. Public sentiment a strong factor. Another was business considerations." Park Street Church is again free from the grasp of business enterprise, and the society is at liberty to join in any patriotic movement to save the property in its present shape. The men who made the bargain with the owners of the property for a purchase have failed to pay the $300,000 of the purchase money within the time agreed upon, and thus have forfeited all claim of any nature to the right of acquiring the property. To learn the entire history of the event, I recommend The Preservation of the Park Street Church, published in 1903. Its 93 pages is available as a free book on Google Books. Several of Mrs. Lincoln's speeches are reproduced in it. In 1901, Mrs. Lincoln became a member of the Animal Rescue League of Boston. A chapter of her biography notes her efforts in the care of animals. Its title is Paying It Forward. Later, Mrs. Lincoln funded the Lincoln Medal for Heroism exhibited during the rescue of an animal. That was before the following event. On March 10, 1909, at 1:50 a.m., there was a large fire at the Lincoln Mansion on South Street in Forest Hills, while Roland and Alice were sleeping. Their 4 maids were sleeping on the 3rd floor, and but for the barking of a little pet dog, Dixie, who roused the Lincolns, the fire could have resulted in the deaths of all of those in the house. Alice and Roland had only occupied the mansion since November 1908. The following are a few examples of the heroism that was recognized by the awarding of the Lincoln Medal. Maurice Spinoza and Thomas Berry. The former was on his way from Dorchester to Boston to see a street parade, but gave up his pleasure to rescue a wretched kitten he saw crawling along the road. It was pursued by boys who had been stoning it and were intent upon finishing their cruel work. He seized the kitten, put it under his jacket, and ran into the house of Mrs. Wheat in Dorchester, of whose Band of Mercy he is a bright and shining member. Mrs. Wheat reports that the boy was stoned and his blouse torn by the cruel little savages who were chasing him. It is very certain that boys who will torture helpless animals will not hesitate to ill-treat little children if they have the chance to do it. Thomas Goggin, who, with a good deal of difficulty, got a cat off a roof, the cat having been there 3 days, and Henry Simpson, who took 2 kittens from boys who were using them as targets on a street in Cambridge. Carl Nelson brought a cat covered with mange from South Boston. Some boys were kicking it up the street when he saw it, and the poor creature had already received quite an injury from these boys. Abraham Scher, 9 years old, found a cat on the street with both eyes closed with mange and brought it to the League. Mention has been made in this report before of the splendid work Mrs. Herbert Wheat of Dorchester is doing for animals. She is president of a Band of Mercy composed of 750 boys, which she has organized herself, and which she constantly superintends. This, of course, accounts for the usefulness of the band. She either brought or sent during the last year 293 cats and 52 dogs to the Animal Rescue League. In her Band of Mercy are 4 boys who, at her request, received prizes, the Animal Rescue League giving 2 medals and 2 books. Arthur B. Corbett received the first medal. He found a wretched little dog at the end of the South Boston Pier. The dog was nearly blind, was covered with mange, and had a large tumor. He walked all the way from South Boston Pier to the Animal Rescue League, bringing it in his arms. Joseph H. Green received the second medal. He saw two boys who seemed to be pushing something down into an ash barrel and covering it up. He chased the boys away and found that they had a cat in the barrel, which they were trying to bury there. The first of the Lincoln Prize medals awarded by Mrs. Roland C. Lincoln is given this year to William Austin, 27 Swallow Street, South Boston, for rescuing from some boys a cat that had its leg cut off and was otherwise maltreated. The second medal goes to Dora Gilman, 48 Kingston Street of Boston, who saw a man kick a cat out of his house into the street. She rescued it from the street and brought it in a dying condition to the League. In 1902, at a fundraiser at the Vendome, Mrs. Lincoln donated an Arad harp, one of the first to have 7 pedals, which was Arad's invention. It was noted as being very valuable and more than 100 years old. It belonged to Mrs. Lincoln's aunt, Anne Sophia Towne Dara. Mrs. Dara was fond of animals, and upon her death in 1881, all of her paintings were sold at auction for the benefit of the SPCA. Mrs. Lincoln made a bequest of $200 to the Animal Rescue League. The most recent article found was the awarding of the Lincoln Medal in 1942 to Stephen O. Sullivan of Malden, 16, and Edward A. McNevin, 30, of Braintree. O'Sullivan rescued a cat from a third-story roof, and McNevin pulled Lucky, a white Spitz, from the path of a train. I checked with the Animal Rescue League, and they were unaware of any recent awarding of the Lincoln Medal. I also searched for Dixie's grave at the League's cemetery in Dedham, Massachusetts, and could not find a marker, and the cemetery could not find a burial record. Mrs. Lincoln's will contained a bequest to Edith K. not to exceed $5,000, as well as various pieces of jewelry. Mrs. Lincoln's will provided Edith with a much larger amount of funds, paid annually, if Alice predeceased him. That caused me to begin a search to ascertain who Edith K. was. An early passport for Edith K. noted that her birth name was Mary Ellen K. She was born on May 4th in 1885 in Boston, Massachusetts. Her mother was Alma K., born in New Brunswick, her father unknown. A certificate of American citizenship, October 12, 1910, at Hankow, China, noted Edith K. staying with Mrs. R. C. Lincoln of Forest Hills, Massachusetts. That person and address was noted as her nearest relative in the USA. A 1926 passenger manifest noted Edith K.'s United States address as Mrs. R. C. Lincoln, 334th South Street, Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. The following are historical items where her name is listed as Edith Lincoln. 1901. A Boston Sunday Post article noted, quote, "There with her husband, Roland Lincoln, a lawyer, and her adopted daughter, a young lady of 18, Mrs. Lincoln spends her home life in quiet, unassuming way. The little family of 3 enjoy the peaceful sylvan rest after a busy day in the city." Unquote. In 1902, a Boston Globe article noted, quote, "Mr. and Mrs. Roland C. Lincoln and Miss Edith Lincoln were passengers on the last outward trip to Saxonia." (1902) Manifest, Liverpool to Boston, noted passengers Roland C., Alice N., and Edith K. Lincoln as passengers. 1918. A Boston Globe article noted, quote, "Mr. and Mrs. Roland C. Lincoln of Stoneleigh Forest Hills and their daughter Edith Lincoln are occupying Little Orchard, their summer home at Manchester, for the season." 1919. A Boston Social Register noted, Lincoln, Mr. and Mrs. Roland Crocker, Alice N. Towne, members of the Mayflower Society. Lincoln, Miss Edith, Stoneleigh, Forest Hills, Massachusetts. It is obvious that Alice and Roland in outward appearances claimed Edith as their daughter. However, I believe they never formally adopted her. The disparity between their bequests to Edith is interesting, as Roland's will benefited her more than Alice's. The 1910 United States Census recorded her as Edith K., living at 35 Washington Street, Malden, Massachusetts. She is noted as a lodger and a stenographer. That address is a few blocks away from St. Paul's Episcopal Church. That may be where she had her training before going to China. Later that year, Edith was an Episcopalian missionary. When Edith arrived in Hankow, China, October 10, 1910, as a missionary for the American Church Mission, Mrs. Lincoln was listed as her nearest relative. Edith's May 19, 1924 application for an emergency passport from the American consular in Peking, China, noted the periods of time she spent in China: October 1910 to May 1915, December 1915 to October 1921, February 1922, and May 19, 1924. It appears that her first 2 stays were as a stenographer. Her third and last stay was a U.S. consulate worker. Edith's 1924 passport noted her as an office assistant for the U.S. government consular service. Again, her legal domicile was listed as Boston. Her 2 previous passports noted her a stenographer and a bookkeeper for the American Church Mission, Episcopal. This picture of Edith was published in January 1926, 2 months before Mrs. Lincoln's death. Edith was employed at the U.S. Foreign Service Mission in Vancouver. I was also able to find Edith's post-1926 life. The name Edith Graffis was noted on the Lincolns' probated will documents when the Lincoln estate was closed on May 31, 1974. From that information, I found that on May 25, 1932, Edith K., aged 47, married John Leslie Graffis, aged 35, at the Trinity Episcopal in Hayward, California. Her birth date, May 4, 1885, matches her birth records and notes Boston as her place of birth. The name of her birth mother is the same on both documents, as well as her mother's place of birth. Edith's husband was a widower with a child, Ethel Jane, born August 21, 1931, died December 10, 2016. Ethel Jane is buried at Hillcrest Park Cemetery in Medford, Oregon. Ethel Jane's birth mother, John's first wife, was Eva Merle Denton Graffis, born July 18, 1903, died August 24, 1931, 3 days after Ethel Jane's birth. She is buried at the Mount Eden Cemetery in Hayward, California. Edith's husband, John Leslie Graffis, born March 3, 1897, died August 28, 1975, is buried at Hillcrest Park in Medford, Oregon. Edith K. died September 1, 1973, and is buried at Hillcrest Park in Medford, Oregon. She rests with her husband John and her stepdaughter Ethel Jane. I performed a search to locate Edith K.'s biological mother and believe that I located her. Various documents provide hard evidence that she married several years after Edith K.'s birth and had children. She appeared to have enjoyed a good life, dying in her 70s. I have chosen not to go any further as it benefits no one. This is Alice North Towne Lincoln. In 1894, she filed a complaint against Boston's Board of Public Institutions, alleging various issues of mismanagement and neglect of the people who were at Rainsford Island and Long Island. She was represented by attorney Louis D. Brandeis. The hearings before the Board of Selectmen began in early March 1894 and concluded the week after Christmas. There were 58 days of hearings, totaling 3,700 pages of testimony. The end result was that her complaint against the City of Boston public institutions caused Rainsford Island to be closed down as a warehouse for Boston's poor. Mrs. Lincoln became involved with the islands in 1887. One of her tenants, Margaret Mulhern, a worthy and tender-hearted woman in Lincoln's words, whose disreputable nephew stole every penny she came by, could no longer pay her rent. Mrs. Lincoln offered to take her to the Austin farm. They went there together on August 11th, Mrs. Mulhern was taken in by a surly attendant with not one recognition of the step that was made that day from independence to pauperism. When Mrs. Lincoln next saw Mrs. Mulhern, she had been sent to Long Island, the Austin farm building having closed. She was very unhappy there. Her clothes had been taken by other inmates and worn before her eyes. One of my letters to her had been opened and read to the whole ward. The food was poor, life miserable, and worst of all, she was thrown with depraved and degraded companions, with whom, naturally, she had nothing in common. She said the life was killing her, and it soon did. Mrs. Mulhern died in April of 1889. Mrs. Lincoln had another tenant, Mary Abbott, who went directly to Rainsford Island. In mid-August 1890, she went to the Boston City Hospital and was diagnosed with advanced breast cancer. She had her infant with her. The Boston City Hospital would not care for the infant or find a place for her other than Rainsford Island. That being her only option, she took the infant with her to Rainsford. From Mrs. Lincoln's testimony in 1894. Mrs. Abbott complained first of having to strip in the presence of others, no screen or curtain being provided as a shelter when the bath, which is the first step in the entrance to an institution, was taken, and that during her stay of 3 weeks she had no towel given to her, and only one clean sheet was furnished. She was expected to cook all her own food and all the food for her baby, and to make and clean her own bed, although she was partly incapacitated by the lump in her breast, which affected one arm. Her baby fell ill on Wednesday, and she could obtain no medicine for it until Sunday, although she asked for it repeatedly, and on Monday the baby died. Her 3-month-old infant Alice died within 2 days of arrival from cholera infantum. Often called the summer sickness, it is caused by milk bacteria. Young Alice died to the lack of proper medicine and proper milk on Rainsford Island. On one of her first visits to the island, Mrs. Lincoln noticed that there were 300+ inmates on Rainsford Island, and about 2/3 of those were old and infirmed women, and only 130 rocking chairs in the facility. Mrs. Lincoln, amongst her friends, raised enough money to purchase 96 rocking chairs and 16 small chairs. March 22, 1890, they were sent to Rainsford Island, but remained on the dock unclaimed by the institution. Mrs. Lincoln had received permission from the Board of Public Institutions. However, they were overruled by the City Council. They did not want to appear to be accepting charity from the public. They didn't want to establish a bad precedent. However, Boston was obliged to accept a gratuity for the paupers. At that time, of the 300+ people held at Rainsford Island, 100 were confined to bed permanently. 100 worked most of the day on the island doing various chores, and the remaining 130 women that were not well could definitely use the rocking chairs. As for the nursery, Lincoln found that it was just 2 rooms with 29 beds and only 19 rocking chairs. The 24 babies in the room had no toys or anything to amuse them. The doctor informed her that there were no unhealthy babies. Many of the women there were victims to all forms of abuse or intemperate husbands. They had no means of support. A constant problem on the island was the lack of milk for the children. On Long Island, the cream was skimmed off the milk and then sent over to Rainsford Island to Superintendent Galvin. It was alleged that the superintendent's dogs were given 1 quart per day. All of the doctors present had requested milk for patients at Rainsford Island. Regarding Rainsford Island's attics, they were in both buildings. There were 108 beds with 26 rocking chairs occupied by old women. The beds were placed under the eaves, with scarcely enough room for them to lift their heads off their cots. She found old women sitting with nothing to divert their attention or occupy their mind. There was no water, no sink, no bath, or any other convenience. The women were obliged to visit the water closet in the nursery. The closet was in the corner of the nursery, and only screened from the room. The air in the nursery could best be imagined as foul. Mrs. Lincoln was not one to be trifled with. She was intelligent, industrious, and very determined. She rubbed elbows with the elite of Boston, and she could rally people together to come to a meeting if she needed support. Another strong point was that she was also a wonderful writer and wrote constantly to the newspapers and gathered her friends to also write letters. My biography of Mrs. Lincoln indicates the many things that she was involved with. She was like a starburst good deeds, trying to help the poor, up until 1908. Those deeds began in 1877 when she was 22 years old. Within a month after the end of the 58 days of hearings in December of 1894, the women were removed to Long Island from Rainsford Island. They were immediately replaced by the children from the House of Reformation, which I shall address shortly. My biography of Mrs. Lincoln details the conditions at Rainsford Island. Those were from newspaper clippings, testimony from the hearings, and government documents. During the first decade of the 20th century, Mrs. Lincoln became the superintendent of Long Island Hospital and then the chairman of the Board of Trustees of pauper institutions in the early 1900s. When the women left Rainsford Island, they were sent back to the Long Island Hospital, which was originally built for them. The women, men, and children were all together. Another item of shocking testimony was given during Mrs. Lincoln's 1894 hearing before the Board of Selectmen. On July 1, 1890, a 29-year-old physician, W. D. Holmes, was appointed physician for both Rainsford and Long Island hospitals. Dr. Holmes's father was on the board of the North End Savings Bank, where Dr. Jenks, the Commissioner of Public Institutions' father, was the president. He was in charge of 600 inmates at both hospitals, where half needed treatment. Dr. Holmes was described by Superintendent Galvin as a person of habit that a physician should not possess, intemperate, an opium eater, kept female company and was in his room all day long with them, neglected the sick and left medicine at night to be dispensed by the night watchman or some other irresponsible party. During that time, a deputy superintendent at Rainsford Island was virtually the superintendent. Quote, "While on duty at Rainsford Island, he took a boat from the island to a hut on the rocks, Portuguese Joe's place. In the absence of the man and his wife, he did such things as he ought not to with a deaf and dumb girl. She virtually belonged at Rainsford Island and had been sent over there as help at the house. They would give her food and drink." Unquote. There were similar transactions with one or more other female Rainsford Island inmate. It was uncertain if any of them were on the rolls as inmates at either Long Island or Rainsford Island. Dr. Holmes was allowed to resign before he was terminated. On May 20th, 1903, the town of Braintree, Massachusetts, recorded a return of death for William D. Holmes, who died at Rivercrest, Long Island City, New York. He was 42 and a physician. His obituary was printed in the Boston Globe on May 22, 1903. It notes his appointment as resident physician at Long Island and Rainsford Island in 1889. His cause of death was noted as from the effects of the heat. Rivercrest was a sanatorium for mental and nervous diseases with separate buildings for alcoholic and drug habituation. After her hard-fought victory in her complaint against the City of Boston selectmen, Mrs. Lincoln did not rest on her laurels. By April 1, 1895, she was on the offensive in pursuit of prison reform, improved housing, and reforms at Long Island Hospital. That day, Governor Greenhalgh chaired a meeting of prominent citizens at the home of Mrs. J. T. Spooner. The governor was there, advocating for the building of a house of correction at South Boston, as well as the state assuming control of the county prisons. Boston's Mayor Curtis spoke in favor of dark cells as a means of punishment. That term is self-explanatory and is the highest form of punishment. Reverend Burns of Charlestown was opposed to the use of dark cells, as he frequently visited the incarcerated. Mrs. Lincoln supported the state assuming control of the prisons. Various items reported by the Boston Globe noted, on December 1, 1895, Mrs. Lincoln and others were scheduled to hold a meeting on December 5, 1895, to present their advocacy for separating the Department of Public Charities from the Department of Corrections. 240 people had already signed a petition to be filed with the General Court. On March 27, 1896, at Mrs. Lincoln's request, a hearing was held for the abolition of the present system of government of Boston's charitable institutions. A report will soon be issued that will enable the Legislative Committee to work more intelligently on the subject. On August 3, 1897, noted that prison labor at Long Island had been discontinued. It was a result of Mrs. Lincoln's famous sensational fight against Dr. Jenks, chairman of the Commissioners of Public Institutions, the same person she took on in the Rainsford Island hearings, and had brought up during the hearings when she recommended the separation of prisoners and paupers. On October 31, 1898, Commissioner Marshall of the Penal Institutions commented on the report of Mrs. Alice N. Lincoln that recommending to Governor Walcott that the state needed to control all penal institutions. He recently returned from Europe, where he made a close inspection of the prison methods there, and that Mrs. Lincoln's following views were of great interest to him. Uniformity of the standard of various prisons. The absence of outdoor exercise and fresh air, so necessary to a healthy human life. The absence of prisoners having to work in the Commonwealth's 7 prisons, the last of what Mrs. Lincoln calls the most serious evil in their 3 prisons, that all of the women were solely under the care of men. On November 1, 1898, the headline noted that Mrs. Lincoln's findings on penal institutions were not solicited and unauthorized by Governor Walcott. However, in early June, Mrs. Lincoln had called on the governor and asked for a letter of introduction to the prison authorities. This, which would have been given to any person in good standing who presented equally good reasons, was granted. It reads as follows: To the wardens of the penal institutions of the Commonwealth and the keepers of the county jails. Gentlemen, I beg to introduce you and commend your courteous consideration Mrs. Rowland C. Lincoln, who is much interested in the institutions of our Commonwealth. Roger Walcott. A hearing on February 21, 1899, described an event that was a classically designed Alice Lincoln response to the government's treatment of her, as noted in the previous article, Rallying the Affluent and Influential. Quote, The Legislative Committee on Prisons gave a hearing at the State House on the petition and bill providing that both state and county penal and correctional institutions shall hereafter be controlled by one body of trustees. The committee was crowded with interested spectators, including many men and women prominent in the community. Unquote. Some of the attendees supporting the bill, no doubt as a result of Mrs. Lincoln's actions, were Moorfield Story, Mayor Josiah Quincy, Reverend William Lawrence, Bishop of Massachusetts, Henry Parkman, attorney, Chairman of the Prison Commission, Dr. Charles F. Folsom, Prison Commission member Joseph G. Thropp, Secretary of the Prison Association, William H. Lincoln, Mrs. Lincoln's brother-in-law, and later to become president of the Boston Chamber of Commerce. Up through March 1, 1900, Mrs. Lincoln fought her battle. Her efforts having failed, Mrs. Lincoln twice attempted to halt the commitment of people with delirium tremens being sent to Deer Island. She presented physicians who noted that alcoholism is an illness, not a crime. That effort also failed. Mrs. Lincoln did join the Prison Reform League as a member, not an officer. In early August 1895, Dr. Heath, head of Public Institutions Department, refused to grant a pass to Long Island for Mrs. Lincoln. The pass revoked as he considered it was in the best interest of discipline of the institution for her not to visit. Mrs. Lincoln responded that when she first applied for a pass to visit, it was for, quote, her friends who were chronic invalids, unquote. It was issued by Herbert Pope, the secretary of the board. When the commissioner learned that a pass was issued, he countermanded it. Mrs. Lincoln noted that when she saw Dr. Heath regarding his refusal, that while she was sitting in the office, she noticed a clerk sign a permit for another lady present who wished to visit a sick friend at the island. Dr. Heath's terse explanation yesterday, as noted above, made clear the reason for the discrimination. Mayoral candidate Josiah Quincy addressed his opposition to incumbent Mayor Curtis because Dr. Heath, in his presence, refused to grant a permit for Mrs. Alice N. Lincoln to visit two elderly friends at Long Island. By 1899, of the yearly admissions at the Long Island institution, 79% of men and 33.6% of women are recorded as intemperates. As the new century approached, Mayor Josiah Quincy appointed Mrs. Lincoln as chairman of the Board of Pauper Institutions. When Mayor Quincy did not run for re-election, Thomas Norton Hart was sworn in as mayor on July 1, 1900. By February 25, 1900, he had discharged 500 employees. The final total was projected to be 2,000. An article in the Boston Globe on February 25, 1900 noted, quote, "Office-changing novelty. The term of Mrs. Alice N. Lincoln as a member of the Board of Trustees for the Paupers has been extended by a voluntary exchange of terms between herself and another board member of the board. This is something novel in City Hall experiences, and it caused a surprise to Mayor Hart, who has just become cognizant of the facts. Mrs. Lincoln's term, as originally arranged, would have expired on April 30, 1901, but by exchanging with another member of the board, which was done with Mayor Quincy's approval just before he retired, her term runs to April 30, 1902, which carries her over the period that Mayor Hart will be out of office. This curious state of affairs was brought about by Mrs. Lincoln and one of the other members of the board resigning their positions. Mayor Quincy reappointed them, giving Mrs. Lincoln the longer term. On December 27th, Mayor Quincy received a letter from the member from whom Mrs. Lincoln exchanged terms, in which it was stated that because of the uncertainty of his ability to give the time to the position, he would prefer to have the appointment for the term ending April 30th, 1901. Unquote. Mayor Quincy communicated with Mrs. Lincoln and she resigned, after which she was appointed to the office for a new term, which expired April 30th, 1902. Quote, Mrs. Lincoln is now chairman of the Board of Pauper Institution Trustees. There is opposition to her holding a place on the board, as she is not a legal resident of Boston, her home and that of her husband being at Manchester, Massachusetts. Unquote. Mrs. Lincoln was a Boston resident. Her husband resided in Manchester, Massachusetts. As a chairman of the Pauper Institutions Trustees, Mrs. Lincoln posted a solicitation of proposal for the building of hospitals and nurses' home at Long Island. The new mayor, General Patrick A. Collins, reappointed Mrs. Lincoln as the chairperson of the Pauper Institutions Department for a term of 5 years. 160 prominent men and women attended the graduation of 8 nurses at the Long Island Hospital. There were 230 patients there, as well as 400 inmates at the almshouse. The Pauper Institution trustees requested $120,000 to expand the buildings at Long Island Hospital, as well as the purchase of tents to house tuberculosis patients during the summer. Mrs. Alice N. Lincoln dedicated the new hospital wing for 41 tuberculosis patients. It cost $40,000. Quote, Mrs. Lincoln attends a meeting at Faneuil Hall that advocated for all nurses to be registered. A bill has been crafted making registration compulsory for practicing nurses. Unquote. Mrs. Lincoln made numerous enemies during her many years of attempting to help the disadvantaged. She never took no for an answer. She was effective, and on a moment's notice could rally Boston's affluent and influential to her causes. She was an intelligent and articulate writer, as well as a commanding orator, that enabled her to reach and move the public. By 1903, as the chairman of the Board of Pauper Institutions, she occupied a seat at the table. In business and government, one can discover that they are the next course at the banquet. Mrs. Lincoln became part of the institutional government and a target of blame from the establishment. I believe that the Boston Sunday Post's July 5, 1903 front page article's caption, quote, "Helps Rule Boston. Advice of Mrs. Alice N. Lincoln is sought by men in high power," triggered a bureaucratic backlash. Women were 17 years away from having the right to vote, and the statement that, quote, "men in high power sought her advice" was inflammatory. In 1894, the 58 days of hearing relative to her complaint regarding the conditions at Rainsford and Long Islands revealed the government's animus towards her. The authorities that controlled both Rainsford and Long Islands had politely tolerated the visits of Mrs. Lincoln and her cohorts, but it is evident they resented her intrusion into what had become both a sinecure and a patronage opportunity. The commissioners, especially Dr. Jenks, resented any criticism of the way in which they were running the public institutions. I previously noted the following event in 1890, where Mrs. Lincoln had pled the case for closing the Rainsford Island Hospital, and upon leaving, Dr. Jenks, the chairman of the Committee on Public Institutions, turned to Charles J. Prescott, one of the commissioners, and said, quote, "Mr. Prescott, have you got any more of your damned old women cranks to bring before me? If you have, you can trot them in now." In response to the many complaints made by Mrs. Lincoln, the board did nothing. It was unlikely that the established members of the bureaucracy had softened their opinion of Mrs. Lincoln by the time of her July 1903 front-page coverage in the Boston Post. Many scores remained to be settled. The public praise given to her placed a target on her back. The following are several samples of the articles published immediately after Mrs. Lincoln was praised by the Boston Post. I have noted a few of the negative articles published by the Post and the Boston Globe. The articles increased in pace and intensity. The blood was in the water. July 23, 1903. The poisoning at Long Island Hospital. 4 patients at Long Island Hospital were poisoned by strychnine. 2 died. The Board of Trustees investigated all but one trustee, found the cause to be a mistake by the druggist. He was charged. The Board of Aldermen intended to investigate the poisoning deaths at Long Island Hospital. The dissenting party in the trustees' report is pushing the issue. Mrs. Lincoln will present the poisoning matter to Mayor Collins when he returns from vacation. Various members of the Boston government reported, quote, "They are anxious for a ventilation of the past administration of the almshouse," unquote. Mrs. Alice N. Lincoln, the chairman of the Board of Trustees of Pauper Institution, has been up against it, so to speak, during the Long Island investigation. Mr. Dobbin's charges have mainly been directed against her as the head of the board, and she has been on the defensive ever since the investigation started, and her cross-examination of Dobbin's witnesses was considered to be very finished. She has enjoyed the reputation of being a very clever woman, so far has demonstrated that she is a woman of remarkable and varied attainments. August 7, 1903. Mrs. Lincoln responded to allegation that her books are not in order. She enumerated her defenses in great detail. August 16, 1903. Mrs. Lincoln denied that an inmate at Long Island was allowed to escape by stealing a workman's boat. February 3, 1904. Representative Patrick Shields filed a bill to abolish the Pauper Institutions Board. March 11, 1904. The culmination of the attacks on Mrs. Lincoln was noted in the March 11, 1904 Boston Globe. Mrs. Lincoln's resignation. Considered it an honor and a privilege to serve city, her interest in institutions will continue. She positively declined to make any statement about how she took the action of the mayor, and said that all she did care to say would be furnished for the newspapers by her stenographer. Her resignation, which follows. Boston, March 11, 1904. The Honorable Patrick A. Collins, Mayor of Boston. Dear Sir, I wish to place in your hands my resignation as a trustee of the Pauper Institutions of Boston, with the request that the same may take effect on April 30th next or earlier, if it seems to you desirable. I consider it an honor and a privilege to serve the city during the past 7 years, and my interest in the work in institutions, and especially in the Long Island Hospital, will continue, although I cease to be actively connected with them. Respectfully, Alice N. Lincoln. March 12, 1904. Mayor Collins yesterday employed radical measures to end the dissension and dispute among the trustees of the pauper institutions. Summoning the 7 members of the board to his office, he requested the resignation of all to effect immediately. All except Dr. William H. Granger complied, and the mayor promptly removed the member who would not resign. Mrs. Alice N. Lincoln, the chairman, had been forewarned. She went to the mayor's office with her formal resignation in her handbag. She tendered the paper as soon as Mayor Collins finished his statement to the board. The mayor then placed the Honorable John B. Martin, a well-established male bureaucrat, Commissioner of Penal Institutions, in charge of the almshouse at Long Island and the city almshouse at Charlestown. The mayor noted he was putting an end to the strife on the board. Actually, only one member was not in agreement with the other 6. The mayor also fired him. Mrs. Lincoln did not withdraw from her advocacy for the poor. On or about April 8, 1904, Commissioner Martin ordered Farmer Bryant to leave Long Island. He had testified on behalf of the previous trustees at a hearing during the recent investigation. Not to be deterred, Mrs. Lincoln filed a bill in 1905 on behalf of consumptives. On March 25, 1905, Sacred Heart Review published the following article. Quote, "The movement in this city in favor of a hospital for consumptives is an excellent one. The need of such an institution is great. Mrs. Alice N. Lincoln quoted figures at the hearing at City Hall last week, showing that there were more than 2,100 cases of this disease reported in Boston last year, and 1,227 deaths. By far the greater number were probably outside of any institution and therefore in a position to endanger lives. We hope Mrs. Lincoln and her associate will be successful in awakening interest among our city fathers in this most important matter. A city which has money to spend in so many ways as Boston, a city which, for instance, can spend thousands of dollars every year to pay hack rides for its aldermen, ought not to be backward about providing a hospital for its unfortunate consumptives." Unquote. After that article, I found Mrs. Lincoln mentioned in only 2 articles of consequence. Both were in 1908. One was her objection to Mayor Hibbard's bill to be able to name a czar who would have the power to wipe out all departments whether or not created by statute. The other noted her intention to speak before the Committee of Public Charitable Institutions as to, quote, "the cruel, almost barbarous system of caring for the insane." Unquote. Mrs. Lincoln's obituary in March 1926 noted that she had been an invalid for the past 15 years. No doubt her decades of advocating for the poor had taken its toll on her health. As noted in the preface, I am a better person for having learned about Alice North Towne Lincoln. Thank you for listening. The script for this presentation was written by William McAvoy. The narration was done by Corinne Eliconi, and the audio editing by Caleb Green.